Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia. The Tigray People's Liberation Front by Dr. John Young. Chapter 2. The primary objective of this chapter is to examine the historical and social development of Tigray from its origins in ancient Axum through its marginalization, which began in Abyssinia and continued in the Amhara-dominated modern empire state of Ethiopia. Historically, as part of the Abyssinian core, Tigrayans have held a privileged position in society. However, from the 10th century, state power generally shifted southward from Tigray, briefly to the Agao, and then to the Amhara lands, culminating in Shoa in the late 19th century. Tigrayan power within the nexus of Abyssinia varied according to, first, the importance of external trade, for which access to Tigray was essential, and secondly, the progressive ecological degradation of the territory's land, both of which fostered emigration south. However, political and economic marginalization, exacerbated in this century by modernization, cannot alone provide an explanatory framework for peasant revolt, since similar processes were being experienced throughout the non-core areas of the Ethiopian Empire without producing such a dramatic response as that which took place in Tigray. An explanation of revolution in Tigray must thus draw the linkage between historically rooted structural factors, the focus here, and a range of political factors which will be examined in the following chapters. Tigray, Emergence and Decline. The known history of Tigray began with the establishment of the Aksumite Empire, but these origins remain obscure. What is known is that the original inhabitants of the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea were Nilotic people who mixed with Hamites and migrated to the area sometime before the first millennium BC. In the early years of the first millennium BC, waves of Semitic people from what is now Yemen crossed the Red Sea, conquered the local inhabitants, and settled at Yeha near the present site of Axum. One group of Semites, the Sabians, intermarried with the Hamites, and their offspring subdued their neighbors and established the Aksumite kingdom. By the 3rd century AD, Aksumite armies are known to have reached Nubia, in what is now northern Sudan, and South Arabia, where they remained, although not without interruptions for the next 300 years. Through the Red Sea port of Adulis, the Aksumites exported incense, ivory, and animal skins to the Greco-Roman world, Persia, Egypt, and the Far East, and imported a variety of luxury goods for their slave-owning rulers. Trade, in turn, brought Axum under the cultural influence of Hellenism. The Greek language was widely used, and Christianity became the official religion of the empire in AD 330, after which the Coptic Church of Egypt began appointing Axum's bishops or abuna. Gez, a language first introduced by one of the Semitic tribes, became the written and liturgical languages of the church and also formed the basis of the present-day languages Tigrinya and Amharinya. Indeed, it was the Christian church and its doctrine and institutional apparatus that were the key links between ancient Axum and the modern state of Ethiopia, not the imperial throne. From their core in present-day Tigray, the Aksumites crossed the Tekeza River and moved south into the Amhara lands. The 4th to 5th centuries probably saw the height of the Aksumite civilization, and from the 6th to 10th century it declined as a result of both external and internal pressures. The spread of Islam, the loss of southern Arabia, and the destruction of the port of Adulis at the beginning of the 8th century served to virtually close the Aksumites' Red Sea door to the outside world and shift the center of political gravity southwards, a process that continued until the end of the 19th century. As the Aksumites moved southwards, they occupied the land over which their descendants were to claim from the 7th century until the introduction of the Derg's rural land nationalization in 1975. The vast majority of the peasantry held land under the Risti tenure system, which ensured that every free-born Christian Abyssinian was entitled to claim land through descent from an Akni Abat or founding father who was held to have once owned the land. Land claims and disputes could go back 20 generations and were originally arbitrated locally by elders, and in this century as land shortages developed, increasingly through reference to the courts. Hereditary rights to Risti land prior to 1974 could not be lost, and unlike Western practice where land is predominantly an economic factor, in Amhara Tigray society, it also crucially involves membership and social status in the community. Slaves, Muslims, traders, and ethnic and religious minorities were not socially respectable and were generally denied access to productive land. A later modification of the Risti system that was to develop in a few small areas of Tigray and throughout most of Eritrea was the Desa, or communal land pattern. Under this pattern, land was held by the entire community and divided up equally by elders every few years as a means of ensuring equality and avoiding absentee land holdings. Although Risti holders could not vary inheritance patterns, they could plant what was desired, commit land in agrarian contracts, lease it for farming by a tenant, give it as a security for a loan, or exchange it temporarily for the use of another parcel. In addition, holders could bar access to their children or favor one child over another. Markakis found Risti rights to be quasi-absolute, and John Bruce concluded that it is valued intensely, and the Risti holder's mental set is that of an owner rather than a mere usufructuary. While the Risti system promoted land fragmentation and the prevalence of small holdings, apart from religious minorities, it prevented land alienation and the emergence of a significant landless class until its demise with the 1974 revolution. At the apex of this land-holding system rested the state with its two arms, the church and the secular nobility dominated by the emperor, for whom land and peasants to work the land were necessary for their survival. The state extracted surpluses through asrat, a tithe on land that varied between 1/5 and 1/3 of the production, and also by the application of taxes on livestock and trade. Cultivators were also required to provide compulsory military service, billets, and provisions for soldiers, unpaid labor on the nobles' lands, and gifts to the nobility on special occasions. In addition, the emperor had the power to grant guilty rights over land to favor individuals who could retain part of the taxes collected and pass the balance to the monarch. Guilty rights were not generally inherited in the secular sphere and reverted to the crown with the death of the holder. In turn, rank and titles were bestowed by the emperor based on services rendered and were also not usually inherited. As a result, the nobility was not self-perpetuating and even commoners could join its ranks. Nonetheless, until the middle of the 20th century, the nobility monopolized control of the administrative and military structure of the state. As well as deriving authority through appointment by the emperor, regional administrators also acquired legitimacy through the loyalty and support of the peasantry, and it was often recognition of such local power that compelled the emperor to make appointments. The church represented the third pillar of traditional Ethiopian society. Church and state were virtually fused, commonly through blood relationships, always through mutual interests, and at the local level often through awardja and warada governors engaging church officials as father confessors/advisors. The church was also a rigidly divided institution, and while those at the top of the hierarchy were usually wealthy pillars of the dominant society, at the other extreme its monks and parish priests were often poor and had far more in common with underprivileged peasants. Although not a centralized body, through local monasteries, churches, and the clergy it possessed vast lands. The church's leaders were also granted guilty privileges, and the central treasury in this century began receiving contributions collected in the provinces. In deeply religious Ethiopia, the church was at the center of the peasants' cultural life, and as a result, the clergy was a class which enjoyed social prestige, economic advantage, and influence second only to that of the political authority, which it did its utmost to uphold. Although there have always been disputes between the secular and church nobility over the distribution of the peasant surplus, they have generally been resolved amicably, and the church has been a crucial institution in supporting Ethiopian unity and maintaining an institutional link between the frequently warring provinces. At the same time, like the nobility and peasants, the local level clergy is parochial and perpetuates local identities. The inequitable distribution of land favored Abyssinia's social hierarchy and rituals of deference, but nonetheless there were strong bonds between superior and inferior based on ties of blood, and what Haben has called a relatively low degree of differentiation in lifestyle, that is, forms of social organization, ideas, and ideals. The myth of a common ancestry, the fluidity of land holdings from one generation to the next, which made social mobility both upwards and downwards common, the low level of technology, and the limited cultural distinctions between gentry and peasant all encouraged the blurring of class distinctions and inhibited the emergence of class consciousness. According to Crummy, Ethiopia had classes in themselves, but not classes for themselves. In a society where the vast majority of people have always been devoted to agriculture, the basic social unit of Tigray is the rural household made up of a nuclear family, which usually includes other relatives. Farming is carried out by individual peasant households, and only in rare instances is collective farming practiced. Like all highland Ethiopian peasants, male Tigrayans prepare their land with a pair of oxen and a wooden plow. Average temperatures on the 3,000 to 3,400 meter high plateau on which most peasant farmers live range from 16 to 18 degrees centigrade, but it is rainfall that largely determines the season and the agricultural cycle. The plateau receives between 550 and 700 millimeters of rain annually, but there are large yearly and regional disparities. The main rainy season, known as Kempt, corresponds with the summer months and reaches its height in July and August, but continues until late September. It is followed by a dry season, which may be broken by little rains called belk, that begin in late February and continue until early April. Typically, there is a single crop season, and in the case of grains, it begins with plowing in early March, sowing in late June or early July, and harvest in late October or November. The social structure, the system of land on which it is based, and the Orthodox Church were the most enduring legacy of Axum. Aksum's empire came to an end in the first half of the 10th century with the rise of the Zagwe dynasty of the non-Semitic Agao people in what became the province of Wollo. The dynasty lasted until 1270 when Amharas and Tigrayans joined together to overthrow it. Power then passed to a succession of Amhara kings who condemned the former dynasty as usurpers and claimed in the 14th century classic, the Kibre Negest, their own uninterrupted line of kings descending from Menelik I, heir to King Solomon and Queen of Sheba. The Solomonic myth was not only used to sanctify the rulers, but also to deify the Ethiopian peoples. It also marked the beginning of a competition for dominance between Amhara and Tigrayan elites that continued until the present day. Amhara-dominated empire. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, armies from the Amhara lands reached as far as Lake Abaya in the south, Inaria in the southwest, and to the port of Zila on the northern Somali coast. It was these conquered territories and those ascribed to have been held much earlier by the Aksumites that constituted the basis of the empire Menelik II was to quote-unquote reclaim in the final days of the 19th century. Unlike Abyssinia in the south, traditional beliefs and Islam were the most common faiths. Pastoralism and communal farming the principal means of production, and the people were not of Semitic origins. Most importantly, the Abyssinian-centered state of the north was mobile throughout this period, and it did not have the capacity to exert complete hegemony over the contesting principalities in the north, let alone those of the south. In response to the population movement of the nomadic Afar and Somali, in 1527 Ahmed the Grangan led a Muslim army from the southeast and with firearms acquired through access to ports on the Red Sea and the support of co-religionists in Arabia and Turkey, quickly spread north, overcoming the more poorly armed soldiers of Abyssinia, destroying churches and causing massive dislocation. Although Ahmed was eventually defeated with the timely assistance of the Portuguese in 1541, the peoples of the northern and central highlands were then confronted with a massive influx of Cushitic Oromo pastoralists from the south, as part of the same population migration. Shoa in particular was subject to Oromo influence, and as a result of these developments, the political center of the very loosely held empire briefly shifted to Gondar, where, for the first time since Axum, Abyssinia acquired a settled capital. However, the power of the monarchy continued to decline as a result of challenges by regional warring blocs. While Shoan rulers paid nominal fealty to the Gondar-based emperors in the north, they expanded their territorial base among the adjacent Oromo lands to the south and west. At the same time, they retained an Oromo belt to the north in Wollo as a line of security against the northern emperors and the constant civil and foreign wars that beset the region. The period from 1769, when a Tigrayan prince, Ras Mikhail Sehul, overthrew the Gondar-based emperor and replaced him with his own favorite until 1855, is known as the Zamana Masafent, or Era of Princes. In this interlude, Ethiopia became, in the view of Hess, a mere geographical expression and led Tigray to become virtually independent, its rulers wielding power comparable to that exercised by emperors of former times. State decay also fostered shifta or bandit activity in the north, and this was further encouraged by the wide availability of firearms in the first half of the 19th century. As a result, quote, it was easier for the armed rulers of Shoa and Begemdir to keep an unarmed population in subjugation than it was for the rulers of Tigray to dominate a population as well armed as themselves. End quote. While access to firearms and the most important trading routes allowed powerful lords like Ras Mikhail to play an important role in Abyssinian political life, Tigray's poverty and lawlessness were contrasted with Shoa's order and prosperity by many 18th and 19th century travelers who attributed this difference to the latter's isolation. As Clapman has noted, while the old centers in present-day Tigray and Eritrea were conveniently placed for trade with the Red Sea Basin and the Nile Valley, they were correspondingly vulnerable to Muslim and eventually colonial attack, and Ethiopia's rulers retreated to the safety of the mountains. Peace and prosperity encouraged Shoan expansion, although by the beginning of the 19th century the territory was far from united and still paid nominal allegiance to emperors of an even more disunited empire. Moreover, while cultural influences were doubtlessly felt further afield until 1880, Shoan expansion, as measured by occupation, had probably not reached more than 100 miles south of what was to be Menelek's capital of Addis Ababa. End of Part 1, Chapter 2. Thanks for listening.